The inaugural issue of the New Thinking Aloud magazine was just released on March 1st. You can download a free PDF copy from the New Thinking Aloud Foundation website. That's newthinkingaloud.org. You can even order a printed copy from nta-magazine.magcloud.com.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, and this is part 2 of our 2-part series on metaphysics and depth psychology. With me is Dr. Stanislav Grof, who was scholar in residence at the Esalen Institute for many years and is currently professor of psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Dr. Grof is one of the leading pioneers today exploring the world of depth psychology. With his wife, Christina, he has founded the Grof Holotropic Training. He is the author of numerous books, including The Human Encounter with Death, The Adventure of Self-Discovery, LSD Psychotherapy, and The Cosmic Game. Welcome again, Stan.
Thank you.
We talked in part 1 about the development of the holotropic experience as a distinct form of a non-ordinary state of consciousness, one that's oriented towards wholeness as opposed to what you call the hylotropic experience. And we've talked a bit about how this experience engenders a certain worldview which is consistent with the worldview as expressed in the perennial philosophy of mystics and sages and saints throughout history. One of the points that you make in your book, The Cosmic Game, is that when you work with people in the holotropic experience, either through breath work or through LSD psychotherapy, almost inevitably questions of an ethical nature arise. People want to know, are they living the right way? They begin to examine their lives from an ethical perspective, and many unusual insights emerge from that.
Yes, it happens on many different levels. You know, the most superficial level of this experience brings, of course, the biographical perspective, where people are questioning whether they are good people, whether they have lived appropriately, and so on. And that's a very superficial way of looking at things, because it usually reflects the perspective that was instilled in them in their family. And then, something that came through the mediation of the culture. But the really interesting things start happening when the process deepens, when it reaches what I call the perinatal level, when people start reliving biological birth and they experience profound encounter with death. They discover a tremendous reservoir of destructive tendencies that are associated with the experience of birth. You know, birth is something that could have lasted anything from an hour to several days, when life was threatened, where there were very, very difficult, taxing kind of experiences, inability to breathe for long periods of time, sort of pains, pressures. And this generates a response in the organism, very aggressive response, that at the same time cannot be expressed in any way. So it leaves us with a powerful repository of this destructive and also self-destructive energy. And so people, when they get somehow conscious insight into the scope and the dimensions of this destructive energy, they experience it as confrontation with what Jung called the shadow. I've worked with many people who would discover, a Hitler or a Stalin within themselves, or they discover a potential for anything that has happened human history and so on.
One of the things that you point out is that people sometimes get in touch with the fact that nature itself is violent, that nature exists by feeding on itself.
Yeah, that's then the deeper insight where people start asking actually questions about the origin, the nature and the origin of evil, and looking at nature and realizing that you cannot basically be alive without this being at the expense of another life form, either an animal or a plant. Joseph Campbell used to kind of make a joke. He had a definition of a vegetarian as a person who is not sensitive enough to hear a tomato scream. But in any way, there is this issue that life is feeding on life. Tennyson talked about nature as red in tooth and claw and so on. So the question is, why is evil somehow in the world?
Yeah.
Why does existence have this dark side? And so usually people go from analyzing themselves and then moving towards the history of humanity, imagining the amount of violence and greed that was running sort of human history, and then moving to the world of archetypes, with the kind of transcendental spiritual principles, and realizing that the pantheon of the archetypes of the deities is dichotomized. There are sort of restful deities, and there are blissful deities, and so on. So in a sense, this dark element is woven into the very fabric of existence. And then, of course, comes the ultimate question, about the morality of the creative principle itself that created the archetypes and created the other levels of existence. And I consider this one of the most difficult and most important tasks of the spiritual journey, to somehow come to terms with the fact that existence has this dark side, and that we all have, the shadow side.
There is a sense, I guess, when people reach a point of detachment from it all, and it becomes like theater, where every good play needs to have a villain.
Well, one of the things that you hear very, very frequently is that when people really reach some deep insights into the nature of existence, that they start seeing the world as kind of a divine play that the creative principle, in a sense, plays with itself. Very similar to what the Hindus say about the world, where they talk about Lila, the world as the divine play of Brahman, of the creative principle. And then the question is, what function has evil in this context? For example, when they asked Ramakrishna, Swamiji, why is evil in the world? His answer was very, very surprising. He said, to thicken the plot. When I first read it, I kind of froze, it shocked me, because I realized what we were talking about. We were talking about, children burnt with napalm, or starving in Ethiopia. We were talking about the Holocaust and Genghis Khan and Stalin, the Gulag Archipelago, and so on. And then I thought about it, and then the more I was thinking about it, the more sense it made to me. You can imagine a kind of a thought experiment where we do a kind of a sanitation of the cosmic game, when we sort of eliminate everything that we consider dark or evil, everything that we feel shouldn't be part of existence. And we can start, for example, with diseases. Imagine a world where nobody has ever been ill. Now, you cannot do it in an isolated fashion. So you also instantly lose the whole history of healing and medicine, and all the heroes of science, all the Virchows and the Pasteurs, the incredible discoveries that sort of helped to eliminate suffering. We lose all the good Samaritans, people who dedicated their lives to, in helping others. So we lose Mother Teresa and her Nobel Prize and so on.
Well, it seems that all human accomplishment is somehow achieved through overcoming adversity.
Yeah, it's sort of difficult to to imagine that the universe would have just this one side. Even some of the worst parts of it, like the violence, for example. If we imagine that nobody has ever been violent, so we lose automatically, for example, the whole history of weapon making, but also everything that's related to defense against weapons, which means all the castles, the fortified castles and fortresses. But we also automatically lose all the art that has ever been inspired by war. The movies, the paintings, the music, everything that somehow portrayed.
Even moral virtues such as self-sacrifice.
But also the heroes who, and the freedom fighters, for example, and the ecstasy of regaining freedom and so on. And if we would take one aspect after another and sort of eliminate everything that is dark, we would see that the cosmic screenplay is flattening sort of more and more until we end up with a very uninteresting story.
Well, it seems then that what's required to appreciate all of this is a delicate balance of compassion for the pain and suffering, and yet understanding that this is the way of the world, and to some extent it's the path of humanity.
Yeah, I think the most difficult part is if we look at this way, that it could be seen as kind of trivializing suffering and also giving us license, to absolutely unbridled kind of violence. I mean, if it's all a game, why don't I just walk around and do as I please? But it's much more complicated, because for people to reach this level of understanding, they have to face the sources of violence within themselves and transform them. For example, on the perinatal level, on the archetypal level, they would also automatically discover karma, that when you don't want certain consequences, you will not do certain things. They would also have a lot of experiences of oneness with other people, with animals, with nature, and so on. They develop tremendous compassion. So, as you are seeing the relativity, you see, of evil, you also are somehow losing the impulse to be violent and to participate in the dark side. And you develop more a potential to be there on the other side, be there sort of in a function that relieves suffering or helps people who suffer.
You tell a very interesting story that I think gets underneath the game a little bit, of one of your subjects in a holotropic experience who encountered was like a deity who was trying to explain the game, that we would create all of these experiences and we would lose ourselves in them. That part of it is forgetting who we are, believing that the experience itself, that the theater is real, and not seeing ourselves as somehow outside of space and time.
Yeah, I think that the most important insight from this, experiential insight from this work, is the discovery of our identity with the creative principle itself. It's something that becomes experientially available to each of us. And then the very interesting question is the question that was raised by Alan Watts in his book, The Taboo Against Knowing Who We Are. If we are really these divine beings, spiritual beings, how come that we opt for something like this, for the body ego? And that's a very, very interesting question. And I think you were alluding to one of the men in our studies in Baltimore. He was actually a scientist who came to have a session for the purpose of insight, scientific insight. And he saw somehow the universe as this cosmic game, as lila, and was asking this question: how is it possible that we get self-deluded and trapped into this kind of a limited sense of identity? And he said he saw the very important part of it was the creation of the banal and the trivial and even the ugly. He said, if we were these ethereal beings, sort of drawing our energy directly from the sun, and we would look to the left, and there's the Grand Canyon, and on the right side the Himalayas, and we're looking at Aurora Borealis, and we're surrounded by Michelangelo's sculptures, and we're listening to Beethoven's music. It would be all too obvious that this is a divine realm and that we are divine beings. And so we were in Baltimore, which is, or at least was at the time, not a very pretty city.
Mm-hmm.
And so he said, so what do we have? Baltimore, these miles and miles of ugly sort of houses, red and black houses, with people living their ordinary lives, sort of physiological functions, snoring, barfing, passing gas, toilets with obscene graffiti and junkyards and so on. And this divine element is given just in small portions. And so he saw the fact that there is so much sort of the ordinary and trivial in the world as actually being an important instrument in feeding this illusion of our false identity.
Well, there's often the sense when one is in a peak experience or a holotropic state, when one is in touch with that sense of the eternal and the divine and the creator, that one assumes it'll just stay that way, that we won't forget.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems as if you can't stay on the mountaintop forever.
Yeah. One important thing in this actually is to, and I have experienced it myself, to be able to see the divine in the lowly, or even in the ugly.
That was a gift of a poet like Walt Whitman.
Yeah. And you are absolutely right. This is something that Ramdas very frequently talked about. In these states, you go out there and then you come down, and there's a natural tendency afterwards to do something so that we can sort of maintain as much as possible of this way of seeing the world. And I think the only way that can happen is that these experiences occur in the context of some kind of systematic spiritual practice, of a discipline, where we train ourselves to maintain that kind of perspective. I've never seen anybody who would just maintain it automatically. It's usually a peak and then coming down. What you usually never lose completely is the insights that you got. You will never see the world in the same way. But in terms of the actual experience of it, that is definitely lost. At best, what we've seen is what we called psychedelic afterglow, like for a few days or maybe even weeks. Sort of that way of looking at the world remains available, and then it's usually more or less lost.
Charles Tart wrote about the phenomenon of state-specific consciousness, that when you enter into a psychedelic or a holotropic state, all of a sudden all of the previous states you were in, the memories come back to you. You can access them in that state.
Yes, I think that's a very, very important idea. I again remember, having sort of repeated sessions, and when I start moving into that state, that's the time when I fully remember what it was like in the. It's not that there's amnesia, but sort of there's something of the vitality of that state is lost, and there's a situation where it sort of comes with full force, comes back with full force, and I sort of realize what that state was like.
Yeah. Well, you've had the privilege, Stan, of being with people thousands of times when they enter into these non-ordinary states, these holotropic states. And based on those experiences, you've developed this worldview, which, or you've noticed really that the people in these states have a worldview which is consistent. It's different, I suppose, than being with schizophrenics who all have quite unique idiosyncratic experiences. But these holotropic experiences seem consistent with the perennial philosophy. Would you, as a philosopher, regard that, therefore, as evidence for the reality of that philosophy?
Well, what struck me first, I mentioned it already, was the parallel with perennial philosophy.
Yeah.
That before I thought about as something that was basically a human creation, that a result of speculation and so on. And I saw the deep experiential basis from that. But what was important from the perspective that you were asking about was actually the overlapping with some of the developments within the new paradigm science, where I now feel that actually some variety of this kind of worldview might very well be part of a comprehensive new way of looking at reality that we'll have in the future, when science and spirituality or mysticism will be, in a sense, united. It will be a synthesis of those two.
One of the points you raise is that according to contemporary physics, the universe itself was created out of virtually nothing, out of a vacuum.
Well, one of the things I was trying to say is that Western science is extremely good in describing issues that have something to do with describing how things work and sort of learning to use it. It's not very impressive in giving some kind of answers for the most fundamental questions, particularly like when you go to the origins of the universe. For example, the most common cosmological theory, which is the idea of the Big Bang, some 15-20 billion years ago. All the matter that constitutes now the billions of galaxies, plus time and space itself, were sort of contained in a dimensionless point, the singularity and so on. Now, that's not a very logical and sober and sort of plausible explanation for this very fundamental problem. And we know the issues related to the so-called entropic principle, that at the very beginning of the universe there were so many unusual coincidences. If only some of the constants and so on would have been off a few percent, you would not have a universe that could support life.
The anthropic principle.
Anthropic, yeah. Which is in a sense, at least allows for an assumption that there was some superior intelligence that was guiding this process or was involved in this process.
If any of a number of physical variables had been changed ever so slightly, life as we know it wouldn't have been possible at all. Yeah.
Then you have the idea that life itself somehow basically emerged out of inorganic matter. Now, if you look at at life, the incredible complexity, the hundreds of thousands of proteins that have to sort of cooperate, enzymes and so on. Or particularly if you look at the miracle of even the construction of a single cell, what it takes to construct a flagella and so on. The idea that all this just simply happened mechanically, is not very convincing. So evolution in nature is a fact, but the idea that it could have happened just by mutations and by natural selection, to me, is not a very convincing thesis.
So without accepting necessarily the conventional religious version of a Father God in the sky, you're...
No, I mean, you can keep everything that science has described, but include the guiding intelligence that this required really some kind of master plan. I think where there's the probably the worst weakness of the materialistic worldview is in the assumption that consciousness could have emerged out of matter. That there was a point in which matter simply became aware of itself. We have absolutely no scientific proof for that. This is really
seems
assumption.
To me, more
camouflages.
likely the opposite, that matter emerged out of consciousness,
Yeah.
which would be akin with all the ancient creation myths.
Yes. So I have in the book a whole chapter where I'm trying to show the weaknesses of the materialistic worldview that tries to eliminate any notion of a higher intelligence that was involved in creation.
Yeah. So the higher intelligence, the idea of a higher guiding intelligence in which we live is really part and parcel of the perennial philosophy and the vision that comes through the holotropic experience.
Yeah. But you don't have to change anything that Western science has discovered in terms of the facts.
Stan, we're out of time.
Okay.
Thanks so much for being with me.
Again, it was wonderful to be here.
It's a pleasure
Thank
for
you.
me, a great pleasure. And thank you for being with us.